I can confirm we've now gone live.
Thank you, Joey. Welcome everyone to tonight's Communities and Environment Scrutiny Panel's review into integrated enforcement. We're going to start with item 1 on the agenda, which is apologies for absence, please.
I've had apologies from Councillor Michael Brossard and Councillor Sandra Ingham.
Thank you, Joey. Item 2 is declarations of interest. It's laid out on the agenda. I'm not going to read it. We all know about it. So, Ian.
Yes, Chair, thank you. My declaration of interest is I'm the Managing Director of Training for Success and endorsed Police Crime Prevention Academy trainer of and provider of Css and the railway equivalent of RSAS. Having discussed this issue with you previously, Chair, and Joey, I believe that this should not preclude me from participation in this evening's event.
I believe that is correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Ian, for that. Okay, item 3 is to welcome Helen Kenny from Thames Valley Police. And Helen is the Deputy Local Policing Area Commander for Bracknell and Wokingham. So, Chief Inspector Helen, over to you.
Lovely, thank you. So, yes, I'm Helen Kenny. I am the Deputy LPA Commander for the Bracknell and Wokingham Police Area. I have worked in Bracknell for a number of years now. I've been in the police for over 20 years, and my career at Bracknell started way back in 2013, where I came over as a sergeant, and then I've progressed kind of through the police force, but always been very local to Bracknell, working closely with obviously Bracknell Forest. So I understand you've asked me to come here to give a bit of an overview around Css and the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme. So do you want me to crack straight on and do that now?
If you don't mind, Helen. Now, Helen, would you like questions all at the end or during your presentation?
So I'm happy either way. The only issue I've got is that I'm doing this on my mobile phone, so I won't be able to see if anybody has got hands up or anything to ask questions. So it might be worth me going through the presentation and then maybe taking questions at the end. That might be an easier way of doing it if you're happy with that.
Okay, we will do that, members. We will just wait for the end of Helen's presentation. And thankfully, I'll be able to see any hands, Helen. So I'll guide you in the right direction. Okay, many thanks. Over to you.
Lovely, thank you. And can I just confirm that members can see my slides that I've shared?
Yep, if you just tell Joey when you want those different slides up, then we will make sure that they're up.
That's lovely. If we can start with the first one then. Oh, these aren't my slides that you can see there. Oh, bear with me.
Sorry, for some reason it's showing the other one. Bear with me.
I can press on without them, Joey, if you're struggling to share them.
I should be able to do it now. Sorry about that.
Lovely, that's great, thank you. So if we can skip to the next slide, please. Lovely, thank you. So what if you just go to the previous one, what I'm going to run through is what actual Css is, the legislation and powers that it involves. I'm going to talk about some examples of some current schemes within Thames Valley Police that are up and running. And then I'm going to give an overview of the benefits of the scheme, talk a little bit about the processes and chat through just some considerations that you may have, and then I'll come to any questions at the end. So if we can skip to the next slide, please. Okay, so Css is a community safety accreditation scheme, basically that allows organisations and their employees working closely in community safety to be given very specific targeted police powers, which are granted by the Chief Constable of the police force. These powers help an organisation to become more effective in their own role and contribute to wider community safety and security, as well as combating crime and disorder, public nuisance, and, for example, antisocial behaviour. So to become Css accredited, all organisations, whether public or private sector companies, pass a strict application process, which goes via the police, and this is detailed by the Home Office and the NPCC, which is the National Police Chiefs Council. If successful, employees of the company are then vetted to a acceptable level and then trained to the prescribed standard. So throughout this, the employees very much remain employed by their own organisation, certainly not by Thames Valley Police, and nor are they directly tasked or coordinated by the police. However, the police do have a role in ensuring that all individual schemes are managed, monitored and assessed at a local level, and that usually comes with an agreed oversight panel or some sort of similar scrutiny panel, often one that might be in place already within the organisations. So the scheme itself creates a framework for public and private bodies to work in partnership with the police, providing often additional uniform presence in communities and capitalising, I think very importantly, on the skills and information that those within the companies, those employees already have when they're engaged within the communities. So do you want to jump to the next slide? So legislation and powers. So Css was introduced following the Police Reform Act in 2002, and it provides for those involved in the provision of overt community safety services a limited range of powers designed to enable them to assist the police in tackling that antisocial behaviour. So section 40 specifically of the Act states that the chief officer of any police force may establish and maintain a scheme and grant that accreditation. There are currently over 40 different powers available to an accredited person, which are set out in Schedule 5 of the Police Reform Act. These include issuing fixed penalty notices for various low-level behaviour offences, powers to control traffic, and the power to require an individual to give their name and address. The accredited persons may only exercise the specific power included in that accreditation only in the force area where they are accredited, and that can come down to a specific very local area. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a whole town, for example. It can just be part of a town as well. The organisation itself that seeks the accreditation will be required to apply to the Chief Constable for the policing powers that they consider appropriate to assist their employees in performing their specific job role. So, for example, from those over 40 powers that are available, there may only be 2 or 3 maybe that are particularly relevant to an organisation or to an individual job role, or there could be as much as up to 10 or 15 that may be very relevant. But the most important thing is that you only get the powers that are particularly relevant for that job role or that particular team. The most common ones that we find in Css schemes tend to be those powers to, for example, require a name and address when somebody is committing antisocial behaviour, to stop pedal cycles, to issue fixed penalty notices for example, fly posting, to issue fixed penalty notices for littering, for dog fouling, for discarding cigarette butts, to require name and address for road traffic offences, to control traffic for the purposes other than escorting a load of exceptional dimensions. So when we talk about the powers, the accredited person can only exercise their powers in the area of the force agreed within their accreditation. And that is obviously with the exception of the power to direct traffic if you're escorting an abnormal load, for example, from one area to another. The accredited person who has the power must clearly display their accreditation badge and they must be wearing their employer's uniform as well. One of the particular powers that the accreditation doesn't give is the power to detain someone. So this kind of is the main difference between Css schemes and our PCSOs, so our police community support officers. So they do have the power to detain a person for up to 30 minutes, ideally until a police officer arrives. But under accreditation schemes, there is no power to detain someone. And that's an important kind of difference to note there. And as I said before, the accredited person doesn't have to have the full powers. They can have any one or two or three of powers. They only take the ones that both the organisation and TVP would feel would be of particular use to them. There are some specific offences that come out of incidents that are committed against an accredited person. So, for example, when we look at things like assault police or resist police, there are specific offences of assault an emergency worker. And it's very similar to this with accredited persons under these schemes. So, for example, it's an offence to assault, resist, or willfully obstruct an accredited person in the execution of their duty, or any person that is assisting them in the execution of their duty. It's also an offence to impersonate an accredited person with the intent to deceive or make any statement or do any act which is calculated to falsely suggest that a person is accredited. It also, for example, is an offence for an accredited person to make any statement or do an act calculated to suggest that they have powers which exceed the powers that they actually hold. So a good example of that would be if you've got an accredited person and they, for example, are asking somebody to give their name and address, and the person refuses to give them the name and address, and the accredited person then goes on to say that if they don't, they will detain them until the police arrive. It can be an offence to do that because they don't actually have that power. So they are some of the offences that come with these accredited powers. Next slide, please. So we looked at some examples, and I've been doing some research for you to have a look at what kind of schemes we've got up and running in Thames Valley at the moment. So as I said earlier, the scheme is mainly aimed at organisations, but both public and private sectors who are involved in community safety. So for local authorities, this could be, for example, street wardens, it could be licensing department, community safety teams, especially those that have specific ASB officers, housing associations, private sector security services, traffic management officers, or even stewards at sporting events and such like can apply for those as well. So some of the schemes that we have up and running in Thames Valley at the moment, we have a few traffic management companies who use traffic marshals. So the sort of powers they would have would be powers to control traffic, powers to require name and addresses for road traffic offences. We have about 3, I think, traffic management companies within Thames Valley at the moment with similar powers to that. Local authority wise, Cherwell District Council has an accredited scheme for their community safety officer, along with their team of community wardens. So the powers that Cherwell District Council have is the power to stop cycles for cycling on a footpath, to seize tobacco from a person aged under 16, to require persons aged under 18 to surrender alcohol, require the giving of the name and address of a person whom an accredited person has reason to believe has committed a relevant offence, the power to photograph persons away from a police station, and the power to request name and address for antisocial behaviour. So that second last power that I mentioned about the power to photograph a person, that's one of those specific powers within that list of 40 that I mentioned earlier. And that's particularly useful when you're looking at enforcement further down the line, but it has to be a designated power within there. Another local authority that has a Css accreditation is the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. They had a number of accredited community wardens. So I don't know if you're aware of those, but they're the community wardens that we call the purple men and women. They wear the bright purple uniforms. They have got the power to issue fixed penalty notices for cycling on a footpath. They've got the power to stop the power to stop cycles. They've got the similar power to require the giving of a name and address if the accredited person believes they've committed a relevant offence. The power to require a name and address for antisocial behaviour. So very similar ones, a little bit less so than Cherwell, but again, very similar powers there. We've also had in Thames Valley a number of bids, so business improvement districts that are inquiring or applying at the moment for Css accreditation. And I mentioned that because obviously Bracknell has a bid within the Western and Southern industrial estates. And it could be something potentially that as a bid they may be wishing to look at. And probably most relevant for us at Bracknell, the Lexicon Security Company, which changed relatively recently, they have just put an application in for Css accreditation. I understand that's been provisionally granted now by the Chief Constable, and they are looking now at the vetting and training process to move that one forward. So way back, I think it must have been in 2017, the previous security company within Lexicon applied for the similar accreditation. That was granted, but then they had, I think, some serious issues around staff retaining and staff training, and that never really got off the ground. But obviously with the new security company in force there, they're looking to progress that one at the moment. So we're monitoring that very carefully. So that gives you a bit of an example of the organisations that we've currently got within Thames Valley Police, and also some of the schemes that we may be looking at in the future as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So just to kind of briefly, I guess, look at the benefits of a Css scheme, to which there obviously are many. I thought I'd just touch on a few that I can kind of think of or that I've identified. And this isn't from experience, obviously, because we don't have a current Css scheme up and running in Bracknell. But this is very much based on research that I've looked at, maybe from some other schemes, or just kind of the way I would see it within Bracknell, and how I think it would benefit both the local authority and the police. So I think having a Css scheme allows for greater partnership work between the police and local organisations, as well as obviously raising the priority of community safety all round. I think, as I said, it brings a benefit to both the police and whoever the accredited organisation is. So for me, I think it increases a uniform presence on the street, because Css accredited persons have to wear a uniform. They have to wear an identifiable uniform of their employing organisation with a clearly identifiable specific Css ID badge, which is issued by TVP, and they usually have to wear that towards the centre of their chest, so it's very easily visible and identifiable. I think other benefits obviously are a reduction in particular local issues, such as could be street drinking or dog fouling. I think to a certain extent there's recognition of the aims of the accredited organisation and its involvement in terms of increasing the overall community safety, and obviously our joint responsibility to reduce crime, disorder and antisocial behaviour. It encourages a closer working relationship with the extended police family. I think it certainly, for me, would give public reassurance as to the professionalism, perhaps, of those involved in those community safety roles, and obviously with recognition of the quality of the accredited organisation. Especially when we talk about, say, for example, the Lexicon or similar, I think it promotes a greater business involvement with the police, and in some ways allows the police to influence the training of businesses. So, for example, the security companies. And locally, I guess, that promoting partnership work in that important two-way exchange of information, and I guess enhanced intelligence sharing as well. So if you think about the likes of terrorism and vulnerability or crime intelligence, if you've got accredited officers with powers who are maybe talking to the public more, engaging more, taking personal details in incidents more, I think this is going to, you know, potentially generate more intelligence. And a good example of that was when I look back to my days when I was working in Windsor and Maidenhead with the then accredited community wardens. Now, at that time I worked with them, they weren't accredited, so they didn't have those powers, and they were very much just being looked into at the time. However, the engagement that they were having with the public was generating so much information for the police around identifying specific vulnerability, and really they were coming into contact with members of the public that perhaps the police never would, and that information and intelligence sharing was really key to some really good bits of joint work. So that is, you know, I'm talking years ago before they were even accredited, but it's just an example of how actually we could really build on the sharing of that information, which, to be fair, is, you know, exceptionally strong, I would say, between you know, partners in Bracknell already, but I think it would enhance that even more. I don't think we can shy away from the fact having such powers would maybe save police time, allowing community safety to be dealt with, you know, so that those low level crime and disorder could be dealt with without the involvement necessarily of police at such an early stage anyway, to that extent. So, and I think that could be a very tangible benefit if the appropriate powers were granted, allowing officers more time to focus on those incidents and crimes where there is greater threat, risk and harm involved. Other benefits, I think, employer-wise, I think employers would benefit from public confidence, that maybe their employees have reached a certain acceptable standard, that they're trained for that post, that they're properly vetted, and I guess the public would probably be reassured that the organisation itself has been approved by a chief constable and therefore reached those acceptable standards. So I am sure there are a lot more benefits that everybody listening can think of, but they're just a few that I think would be of great benefit. So next slide, please. So looking at some of the processes that are involved in getting a Css scheme up and running. So to qualify for the scheme, organisations need to pass a strict application process. They then need to, if successful, vetted, complete Css training, run by an approved training provider, not the police. And obviously these individuals remain employed by the organisation, not the police. If somebody wants to go ahead with an application, in the first instance, they need to contact the designated Css officer in our strategic governance department, details of which I can provide myself. And when we look through that application, we look at what powers would be sort of applicable for the applicant. That whilst that's a decision that's very much made at force level, there is lots of consultation with myself and also with Superintendent Andy Cranage as well. So although it's certainly not a local level decision, it's something that's made in close consultation with ourselves. So when an organisation is looking at applying for Css accreditation, the Police Reform Act sets out a number of requirements on a force chief officer before they can make that accreditation. So the chief officer of a force needs to be satisfied of certain conditions. So I will run through those, albeit very briefly. So the employing organisation, or the applying organisation, if you like, must already have in force a satisfactory complaints procedure. The employing organisation must be fit and proper to supervise the work of an accreditation person. And that really means that you need to have a fit and proper supervision structure or management structure in place to oversee the work of the accreditation officer. The employee needs to be suitable to exercise the powers that are conferred upon him. The employee needs to be capable of effectively carrying out the functions for the purpose of which these powers are being conferred upon them. And also the employee, as I've mentioned previously, has to receive adequate training for the exercise of these powers. So the chief officer cannot grant the accreditation unless they're absolutely satisfied that the persons concerned have received the adequate training. And that training really does depend on the roles being carried out by the accredited person and the particular powers that are designated to them. It's also the responsibility of the approved employer to ensure that its employees receive that training to the force's satisfaction. Procedural wise, for vetting, obviously that's another very important thing to go through. So all accredited persons have to be vetted to non-police personnel vetting, MPPV level 2. Another requirement I touched on earlier is accredited persons have to wear, sorry, bear with me. Accredited persons have to wear a uniform and a nationally agreed Css badge. Police, so Thames Valley Police will issue them with a Css identification card, which has their name, their photograph, and the specific powers that they've been granted is also stated on there. They must carry that card and produce it every time they use their accredited powers. Now that is obviously with the exception of one of the powers, which is the controlling of traffic, and that is obviously just for logistical reasons. But you can see there may be a cost implication if a certain accreditation scheme, for example, maybe didn't have a uniform. When you look and do some research, you can see that a uniform can be anything from a polo shirt with a logo on to some schemes that just have high-vis vests, and then there are other schemes that have a fully kitted out, almost PCSO style uniform with stab vests, local radios, they have high-vis jackets, they have the cargo trousers, they have police issued boots. So it really does depend on the nature of what those powers are, how an organisation is going to be using them, and the practical applications of those powers. The Css badge itself, I didn't have a logo. I think that I didn't share it on the presentation, but it's a really well recognised nationally red and black logo. Has to be worn on the uniform before they can exercise the powers granted. Usually, as I said earlier, displayed on the chest region, just to ensure that it's really highly visible when dealing with members of the public face to face. I think that's probably it really for the processes. I mean, I could talk in a lot more detail about the processes. However, it's probably not applicable really at this stage, because this is just to give you a bit of an overview. And obviously, if further down the line we were looking at actual, applying for Css accreditation, obviously I'd be able to guide you through processes in a lot more detail then. Next slide, please, Joey. So some of the considerations that a scheme would have to think about, first of all, would be the tasking of the employees. So if you've got accredited powers, you're going to have to think about how you are going to task those employees accordingly. And certainly it's not for the police to task, but rather the organisation themselves. However, an organisation may wish to capitalise on some of the partnership structures that we already have in place here at Bracknell. So, for example, we have our PPSG, which is our partnership problem solving group. The police run their partnership TTCG, which is their tactical tasking and coordination group. You also have joint local authority and neighbourhood policing operations. So although it's for the organisation themselves to task, there are a number of really good, strong partnership structures that we already have in place that would really maybe be able to assist with some of that tasking and monitoring of the accredited powers. One of the things I touched on about earlier is liability. So I said that when an organisation applies, you need to have a recognised complaints policy in place. So specifically in section 40 of, or 49 rather, of the Police Reform Act, it states that a force should ensure that the employers concerned have satisfactory arrangements for handling complaints. Each organisation that employs a accredited person will have its own complaints procedure, which members of the public should first apply. And similarly, around liability, if an accredited person is sued for unlawful conduct while the accredited person remains under the control of their employer, and in the event of civil action resulting from the unlawful conduct of an accredited person, it's the employer that is held or may be held jointly responsible for that. Some of the other considerations that you may wish to look at are processes around, if, for example, we were looking at powers of fixed penalty notices, do you have the right structures in place to be able to give out fixed penalty notices? And do you have the right structures in place within an organisation to escalate and take cases to court where somebody refuses to, for example, pay a fixed penalty notice? So they are all the practical considerations that an organisation would have to look at if they wanted to apply for such schemes. Another sort of very practical aspect you need to look at is high staff turnover. And I think traditionally this is where a lot of the private schemes, rather than local authority, for example, schemes fail, is because of the sheer high turnover of security staff. So a lot of the schemes find that they will apply, but as soon as they have a cohort of staff ready to go on the training, there's such a high turnover of staff that they can never get their staff accredited or trained in a suitable time frame to be able to start using those accredited powers. So that's something that's certainly for consideration in some of the private schemes maybe, or other schemes where you have a high turnover of staff, is how you manage that staff training. I'm sure there's lots of other considerations as well. However, they are just a few that spring to mind. So hopefully, next slide, Joey. Thank you. So hopefully I've given you an overview, albeit relatively brief, about what the schemes are, the basis of why you may wish to have a Css scheme, the benefits that it can bring to an organisation, but to the wider community, I guess, which is the most important thing. But I am happy to take any questions that anyone has, albeit I can't see anyone.
Okay, many thanks, Helen, for that. That was a very informative presentation. I will throw you to the lines now for questions. We'll start with Mary, please.
Thank you very much. My question is really that all this seems to be what PCSOs could do, and I love PCSOs and I work with them in my community and they do superb jobs. So wouldn't this be totally unnecessary if we could actually get more PCSOs and keep them?
I think you're right, Mary. There's a real crossover with some of the powers that a scheme can be accredited and some of the work that PCSOs do. But I would say that PCSOs have a huge role within the community beyond enforcement. And enforcement is just a very small part of what our PCSOs do. But I do agree that there is, some crossover. But I do think if you look, for example, say if you take the lexicon as a scheme, if you look at the amount of security officers that they have there, if those security officers have certain powers to deal, for example, with some begging in the town centre, to ask people to get off their pedal cycles, that is far more effective than maybe calling a PCSO in, by which time the incident may have passed. It's very much, if you had securities officers that were there, they could deal with them then and there. So I think you're right, there's an absolute crossover, but I still think there would be some benefits to having some accredited schemes in particular areas.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Tricia, please.
Sorry, I thought that was Ian first. Okay. Sorry, I've got a number here. Saving police time, less required for low-level incidents. Will these officers, accredited officers, have a duty to refer any information about sort of repeat offenders to the police so that they can build up a profile it's not going to be a huge surprise when somebody like that does something serious.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, that is one of the benefits of it, because you can collate that information that can be shared with the police, and then the police can then look at some other powers under, you know, ASB legislation. So, for example, if you've got a repeat offender, the police and together with the community safety team could be looking at issuing community penalty notices. They could be looking at getting criminal behaviour orders, so they can use the information to certainly escalate the enforcement further. So it certainly would be of benefit to do that. And I don't know what that process, you know, would be exactly, but I think for repeat offenders, we would have to have something local in place to look at that escalation and maybe have a defined escalation process.
Right. If I may, Chair, I've got a couple of others.
Yeah, no problem, Tricia.
Thank you. The applications, vetting, training, so on and so forth, the processes for accredited organisations, how often is this checked with the accredited organisations by the police? And then you can do it first time. Do you go back and check on a regular basis so they've still got it right?
So in terms of when the vetting is repeated, the police do repeatedly do it, but I'm not quite sure when the timescales are, so I'll have to take that away and find out for you if that's okay. I certainly know with some of the we vet some of our local authority workers who we work quite closely with, and their repeat vetting is done now every 10 years, but I'm not sure if it's Css Screen, so I'd have to take it away and look.
Okay, that sounds a long time.
Yeah.
The uniforms and badges and things, there's going to be a huge variety of such accredited things, and how do the public honestly recognise who they can trust? I mean, they won't know what to look out for. It's not like a distinctive police uniform, and that worries me somewhat.
Yes, I agree. I think a lot of that comes from, you know, a really good communication strategy. It comes from the use of good social media. I think if you look at some schemes, for example, community wardens in some local authorities, it's so obvious that they are a community warden. They have their local authority's name on their backs. They have, it's very visible that they're a community warden. Or, for example, some security companies, you know, if you walk up and down the lexicon, for example, it is very obviously you can pick out who the difference between who's a security officer in the lexicon and, for example, who's a PCSO or who's a police officer. So that, I guess that's the importance of that uniform. They have to be very identifiable. But I agree, there is that trust issue. But I think that can only come with, as I say, a really good communication strategy. Okay.
And last one, if I may, and high turnover of staff for these positions. Has anybody done an assessment as to why that is and try and sort it out?
I guess that would depend completely on the organisation. There are, you know, some roles that have exceptionally high turnover of staff. For example, security companies, when we look at some of the work we do within the retail industry, they have a very high turnover of staff. It's more, I guess, to do with the role itself. It's not something that's apparent in the local authority schemes, but certainly there are just, you know, some employment where they do have a high turnover of staff.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Tricia. Ian, please.
Thanks, Chair. I've got 3 questions and some examples which will hopefully reassure Mary in terms of her very valid observations. Am I permitted to ask those 3, John, or would you like me to ask one and open up to anybody else?
No, if you ask one, let Helen answer, and then ask the other 2, that's fine.
Oh, brilliant. First of all, Helen, a very comprehensive presentation. So thank you very much for that, even though the IT gremlins were perhaps against you. What you said is music to my ears. But I have to say, from professional experience, this has been a bit of a slow burn for many forces in terms of recognising the huge benefits that you've pointed out in terms of CSAS accreditation. My three questions are really around the process. And you talked about vetting, but I'm wondering, how long does Thames Valley take for the initial vetting? Because there have been some forces that have taken ages to do that initial vetting. So it slows down the procurement of training. So rule of thumb, Helen, what's the initial vetting for Css operatives?
So at the moment, I can only go on the lexicon one. And I understand vetting is about 2 months to 3 months at the moment. Obviously, as you can understand, the vetting is obviously being done by the same department that are vetting the high influx of new officers that we're getting as well. So, you know, it's difficult and we've got to prioritise that. But yeah, it's, as I understand, about 2 to 3 months at the moment.
That sounds wholly reasonable. I've heard some horrible stories of it going into years. So Helen, that sounds great. And excluding the training costs, which are external, I understand that. What is the cost for registration for Bracknell Forest to go down this route? What is the cost to register the council on this scheme?
If I'm honest, Ian, I don't know what the costs are. I would take it away and have a look at it for you, and I'd be able to get back to you. I've got on that last slide, I've put Maria Hepworth's details on there. So, and her email. So Maria is our Css officer in strategic governance, and she has all the detail and will be able to answer any of those questions. So you can come through me and I'll get back to you, or you can go direct to Maria, whichever's easiest.
Okay, then, brilliant. And you're quite right in terms of the 40 odd powers, that it's not a case of you're Css and you've got all those powers. There must be a degree of evidence based in terms of what powers an organisation would apply. But I'm just wondering, what level of information would you require from an organisation to support, you know, the endorsement in terms of a particular power? What evidence would you be looking at? What sort of levels of examples would you be looking at to say, hey, yeah, they've got a real good business case here, we will endow that power with the organisation?
So there doesn't have to be a good degree of evidence presented. And I think that's especially important where the local consultation with myself and Superintendent Cranage comes in. In the particular case of the lexicon in the Bracknell Town Centre one, for example, from their list, they were able to apply just based on the general information of the sort of incidents that happen within a town centre. So they didn't have to give detailed evidence of the amount of, you know, offences that they would have or the types of ASB that they would tackle. But we would have to look, say, for example, there's a PSPO, so a public spaces protection order. So we do need to look at the specific powers around that and have some consultation with your, for example, your community safety team when we look at if there was going to be a request for certain powers that would cross over with the PSPO, for example. So we'd be looking to consult further with the community safety team, for example, around that. So that might not answer your question entirely, Ian, but I think it's more about the overall, is the powers that they're asking applicable to the situation and, for example, the organisation or the private company that they are. So in the case of the lexicon, when they'd done their application, that then went from force level to myself to review. And if, for example, in the town centre, they had asked for some sort of traffic management powers, that would have absolutely been, you know, denied because it's not relevant. But the fact that they were asking for a power to request the name and address of persons acting in an antisocial behaviour or in an antisocial manner and confiscate alcohol when people are acting in an antisocial behaviour manner, they seem completely proportionate to the town centre. And the information we know about it. So I guess it's more about, are they proportionate to the organisation and not the organisation, the specific team within the organisation that may want those powers.
Helen, yeah, brilliant. You've answered my question. The degree of consultation, is it, and evidence base, which is great. In terms of Mary's point earlier, I wholly agree with her. We've got some really talented PCSOs, and for me personally on my ward, you know, that liaison with them is crucial. But perhaps a few examples from my own knowledge of how the scheme has worked really well. I'm very aware of what's happened with our neighbours at the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. And I think that's a great example of enforcement staff that have been given a series of enforcement powers that have allowed them to really make a difference in terms of lower level antisocial behaviour. And you'll be familiar with the broken window syndrome, that if we don't deal with the lower level hanging antisocial behaviour, don't be surprised that the more serious intrusive offences occur. So it's vital that any way that the community can provide that first tier of community resilience is really, really important. I think on that word resilience is another benefit that I've personally seen, and two examples come to mind of what's happened in TfL is TfL used to pay the Met round about 50 grand a year of an officer to stop vehicles so they could carry out taxi compliance tests. Once those staff were trained up with the ability to carry out traffic management, they were able to stop the vehicles safely and carry out those compliance checks. So saving a significant amount of money for that particular borough in London. Kingston University is another good example where they were able to take on the bulk of managing antisocial behaviour and public disorder around the campus at university, which is huge. And the Met acknowledged that the draw on police resources significantly dropped because they were able to manage that process. I've done some postgraduate work around this as well, and it's very compelling evidence that the July the 7th London bombings may well have been frustrated if we'd had Css. When colleagues of mine from the University of Portsmouth went to speak to people that worked for the local authority and postal workers, they brought all that intelligence together, which showed that the bomb-making factory, which is the Masonette in Leeds, they had all this intelligence. If it had been brought together under the umbrella of Css, that probably that intelligence would have led to the police at least knocking on the door. So the benefits that you talk about, sort of that intelligence sharing, is vital. So finally, I'd like to say I'm a passionate supporter of Css. I'm really pleased that Thames Valley Police are really supporting it, and I think it would add significant value to the council. But Helen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Tricia, is that an old hand or a new hand, please?
Oh, it's an old hand, I beg your pardon.
Okay, no problems. Does anybody else? Bob Angel, please.
Thank you, John. Helen, thank you very much for what you've informed us about. And it is very informative. Number of questions, but firstly, when you've got these people trained up and they're out there on the street, and you were talking about they can ask for names and addresses, what happens if somebody says, off, I'm not giving it to you? What do they do then?
And I guess that's why I alluded to that an organisation needs to have that structure in place to escalate, because it then becomes an offence if somebody fails to give you a name or address, and then they can then be prosecuted for that. So it's really important that you've got those structures in place to be able to do that. However, I think that's why I alluded to earlier, the really important part to have is to be able to take photographs. Now, most organisations would use body cam to take such photographs, but you then can allow yourself to identify those persons, because you've got that power to take a photograph in a public place. So when somebody doesn't give their name and address, you can then have a photograph, and then you've got a system whereby you can then circulate to try and identify those persons.
Right, thank you.
But you don't, the accredited persons would not have the power to say, for example, detain a person and say, well, I'm detaining you and ringing the police, for example, because they don't have any powers of detention in those circumstances. They would just rely on taking a photograph or CCTV that may be, in an area already.
Right. If I can, I mean, this is a bit personal, because in terms of where I live, which is Warfield Park, which is a private estate,
Yes.
Do do these wardens, or can the management of a private estate have such wardens as you describe and have the powers if they want to?
So it has to be an employer or an organisation. So in Moorfield Park, for example, if you had a set security scheme in place, then it would be the security scheme that could apply. Or if you had an organisation that employed wardens, they could apply. So yes, individually, an organisation could apply, but you have to have that organisation. Does that make sense? If using Moorfield Park as an example of an estate.
Yeah. I mean, there's not, I have to say, there's not much crime over here. And I have to say, the one crime that there is speeding. And,
right. Okay.
And clearly with a lot of, shall I say, senior elderly people like me, walking around with their dogs and what have you, that can be an issue. But it's just interesting to learn if the management company wanted to, then they could apply.
Yes.
To have a warden, and does the warden actually have to spend so many hours a week patrolling or doing what they do, or can it be spasmodic?
No, they don't. There's nothing
here, a couple of hours there.
There's nothing within the legislation that says the company that have the powers have to spend a certain amount of hours enforcing those powers or patrolling to try to enforce those powers. There's nothing within the legislation that says that. However, to accredit an organisation with the powers, I guess one of the questions would be, when the police force were looking at an application, would be how many people would you be looking to train up and vet? What would be the structure? Because I guess you wouldn't accredit a person who was maybe going to do 2 hours a month of patrol in a certain area, because I don't think that would necessarily be effective. I guess when granting those accredited powers, we've got to be satisfied that it's going to be a very effective scheme. So I guess, although there's nothing in legislation about the hours, it would be something that would be looked at within the application. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, I understand. And thank you for your answers. Very.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Does any other member have a question, please? I have a couple for you. Oh, Tina,
yeah,
please.
Sorry, Bob. Thanks, Bob, for that question, because that was really interesting, some of which I wanted to pick up. However, Helen, sorry if I missed this, but is a council termed as an organisation?
Yes. So Bracknell Forest Council could apply for the powers, but you'd be looking at what department within a council would be wanting those powers. For example, the organisation, but it would be what department. So would it be your community safety team? Would it be licensing offers? Would it be somebody within the public partnership protection? It's you wouldn't get a blanket.
Okay. So we've got that level of local authority, Helen. So can we pop down to the next of a level, which is parish? You and I have had a lot of conversations about antisocial behaviour in Crowthorne. Is there any chance, for instance, our groundsman, who does a lot of clearing up after our antisocial behaviour, shall we say, is there any chance of us saying, could he be a member of this organisation? Would be a CSAS if he was properly trained? Is that doable?
So you would have to look at who is his direct employer, what's the line management structure and supervision for him, and all those sort of that list of things that I said earlier that we had to be satisfied were in place. So as his direct employer, is there a complaints process in place? Does he have the ability to issue fixed penalty notices? Under what structure would he take if somebody doesn't pay a fixed penalty? How would you take him to court? So it's more about the practicalities of that, I would say.
Sure.
And that would probably be very difficult when it came to looking at it at a parish level.
Yeah, I get that. Can I grab you? Really, sorry, John, for the simple reason, 16th of June, we're having one of our CNAGs and we're having our MP come to talk to us. Any chance, Helen, you being free that evening to come and talk to us about this? We get a very good response from our local community, I say, about 30 odd people turn up. But think about it, I'll ask Mel to send you an email.
I was going to say, I'm making note of the date now.
Bless you, 16th.
Get Mel to send me an email with all the details. I'll have a look at it.
Thank you very much indeed. That's smashing. Absolutely.
You're really welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Does anybody else have a question, please? Okay. Helen, my quick question is, and I think you might have touched on it. I'm assuming that an organisation like Bracknell Forest obviously has many arms.
Yes.
So we can obviously then have different employees with different accreditations or different qualifications to, say, for example, a licensing officer might have the power to stop vehicles, i.e. taxis, but our wardens might have the power to deal with littering, antisocial behaviour, dog fouling, etc. Or do they all have the same powers?
Nope, they can be, and quite rightly, absolutely specific to the role that they're carrying out. So yeah, perfect example for a licensing officers stopping those vehicles, which would be completely inappropriate for, you know, somebody else. So yeah, it can be different powers to different departments.
Okay, and just one last one. I don't know if it's covered in the 40 powers available, but we had a presentation last week from our licensing people, and one of the things that a warden can't, or somebody that's going around issuing PCNs for parking in wrong areas, we can't actually issue notices for parking on pavements, which is a very a good concern, you know, where people inconsiderately park on a pavement, blocking that pavement. So if somebody's coming along with partial sight or buggy, it makes it very hard for them. So is one of those powers that you can actually start issuing fixed penalty notices for pavement parking?
I'll be really honest with you. I don't know the full 40 powers off the top of my head. I would be able to have a look. I don't think it is, because I did review them about 6 months ago when I was looking at an application, and I really can't recall it being on there. But I would, you know, I would have to check and get back to you on that one.
Thank you for that, Helen. I think Mr. Kirk's going to answer the question.
He may well know. I'm sure he will, in fact.
Bless you. You are, both of you, far too kind. What does a man like me with no hair know? Antisocial behaviour is very embracing. And if you look at the definition of antisocial behaviour, blocking pavements and disrupting and causing anxiety to community is antisocial behaviour. So I've done a bit of work with one of the railway companies, and they get too focused on their bylaws rather than thinking of anything that's antisocial behaviour can be engaged with this process. So rather than looking at maybe specific bylaws, look at, is it antisocial per se? Does it cause that anxiety to other people? And I would say it does.
Okay, thank you for that insight, Ian. Okay, members, anybody else have any questions, please, for Helen? Sandra, please.
Oh, thank you, Chair. And do forgive me if this has been touched on earlier in the meeting, because I've just come segued through from one committee to another. So I've just joined you. My question is, I've been working with a resident recently on dog fouling and discovered that the fine for dog fouling nowadays is £1,000. So, well, my question is, well, how does that actually get enforced? Because what power does an ordinary citizen have to, you know, implement or make happen such a fine?
Okay, so bear with me. I was just getting up the list of those 40 powers to answer the previous question. So in terms of dog fouling, I guess it's very difficult, isn't it? Because you will see a member of the public, perhaps, with a dog, their dog will foul. You want a means to report that. You don't know who the person is. This will usually happen in a location where there aren't CCTV cameras and the person can't be identifiable. So, you know, one resident isn't going to approach another resident and demand their name and address to report them. So therefore, it becomes a very, very difficult issue to manage. And that is one of the key, where you have community wardens with Css accreditations, that is nearly always one of the powers that they request in there, because when they're out and about on patrol, they may well see the actual incident happen, because let's face it, you can only do that when the incident's in progress. So they can then issue the ticket. Otherwise, it does become very difficult. I mean, for example, if you look on the Bracknell Forest Council website, it tells you what to do in cases of dog fouling and how you can report it to the council. But how they then enforce that is, you know, we can understand the practicalities are very, very difficult, aren't they?
Yeah. Yes.
I think that's one of those examples where this Css accreditation can be really, really effective and have a really positive impact on the community.
But from the residents' point of view, they think it's unenforceable, so it doesn't really bear any weight. You know, they sort of see this huge fine and everybody goes, oh yes, but you know, it's not going to happen. It's difficult to manage. It is.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sandra. Anybody else, please? Okay, I see no more hands. So Helen, again, thank you very much indeed for taking the time out to talk to us tonight. I think every member will agree with me in saying it was a very informative presentation. It's given us lots of food for thought, sown many seeds, and I'm going to stop with the puns there. But we'd like to thank you for that. And I'm sure, I believe it was Maria, will probably be getting an email from Joey just asking to clarify some of the points that were raised tonight. But again, thank you for your time tonight. And we wish you every success in promoting Css across the whole Thames Valley Police area to assist.
That's lovely. Thank you for your time. Apologies again for the technology issues, but thank you for having me this evening.
No problems at all. Many thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Members, Joey, if you could just stop the recording, please, for us.